Hi everyone, welcome back and welcome to this session on Defence Acquisition Wargaming. I'm Graham Longley-Brown from the Connections UK team, and with me is Chad Millett. Just a quick word on questions before I introduce chat. They can be posted into the Discord chat, but we're not going to answer in detail, or Chad is not going to answer in detail questions about acquisition per se. Put them into the chat if you want, but could questions please concentrate on the wargaming aspects of what Chad is going to talk about. Okay, so Chad was asked to give this presentation actually by Matt Caffrey. He is the Space Systems Command Chief Learning Officer and is a published author on acquisition. He's going to start off by telling us about acquisition and then concentrate on the wargaming aspects. But before we go any further, Chad, your son got married on Friday. You have moved heaven and earth to be with us, and you're speaking from a hotel room. So before we start, thank you so much for that. You've gone above and beyond. I will hand over to you on that note of thanks.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Graham. It was a wonderful ceremony. I was glad I got to be there, but more to the task at hand. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on the time zone that you're in. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present this idea, this concept that has been mulling around in my head, the idea of acquisition wargaming. As Graham said, I am the Chief Learning Officer for the Space Systems Command in the United States Space Force. And so we'll be talking about acquisitions. I want to level set acquisitions for everybody so that you understand a little bit about it and why I think wargaming has what I'll go into 3 particular applications to help support the acquisition workforce. So it might look something like this using some sort of pop culture references from the Big Bang Theory. And if these terms don't necessarily ring true to you, they will a little bit, at least be a little bit more familiar when we get into what is acquisitions. But the idea of a Dungeons and Dragons type role-playing game or a pandemic type cooperative game, and those are just the kind of easy button games that I've come up with that might work and apply, might go something like this. And I don't know that many of our acquisition colleagues would be playing with William Shatner and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but that, we can all dream. As I mentioned before, what I would like to start with is just level setting everybody on Department of Defense acquisitions, because it is kind of an atypical application of wargaming. And so I want to talk about acquisitions first, then I want to get into how we could apply wargaming to this field that has not really taken advantage of the capability fully to this point. Department of Defense acquisitions. I believe it is without a doubt that we have the most capable military ever in the world, and that is absolutely attributable to the airmen, guardians, sailors, soldiers, and Marines. But it is also attributable to the weapon systems, the incredibly capable weapon systems that those military personnel have at their disposal. And they have them at their disposal. That they have them in their disposal is no accident. The acquisition community, the Department of Defense acquisition community, and I will focus on the Air Force and the Space Force, which is my history. The acquisition community works very hard to provide and deliver this warfighting capability and then continue to sustain it, as you see the B-52 in the graphic there, that has been around longer than some of us have been on the planet. When I talk about acquisitions, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. In order for weapon systems to be delivered and capability to be delivered to the warfighter, all 3 of these processes you see in the circle, which can be considered the big A acquisition process, have to work. The Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System is how we identify what the needs are for our military, what capability gaps exist and that need to be filled with materiel solutions. The Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution circle, that is how we identify and budget for the funds that will be used to acquire, develop, and sustain those capabilities. And then little a acquisition on the DoD, where we have a set of instructions. That's what DoD 5000.2 is referring to, a set of instructions that lay out how we do the acquisition process. When I talk about applying wargaming to Department of Defense acquisition, I am mostly focusing on little a acquisition, but as there is significant overlap and the way to successfully deliver capability involves the interaction of all three processes, I also believe that the wargaming will leak into those processes as well. But initially, some of the examples that I'll give will sound very little a acquisition focused. And even within that little a acquisition, it can be a complex problem and process. Recently, the Department of Defense released what they call the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, recognizing that there are at least 6 typical acquisition pathways that, when we acquire capabilities, that we can follow. And you can see them here, the urgent capability acquisition. I'm going to jump to major capability acquisition, because then when I say middle tier of acquisition, you might know why they call it that way. It's because it's in the middle between urgent and major capability. And then recognizing that acquiring software, defense business systems, and services instead of a system are different enough to merit their own type of framework. Now, we're not going to go through all of these. One of the things you'll notice on this slide is that in general, the Department of Defense is abbreviation and acronym heavy. I think maybe the acquisition community takes that to an exponential level with the amount of abbreviations and acronyms that exist. We'll refer back to this chart later, but my point is there is a defined process, and recently a recognition that there's not just one way to make it through there, depending on what the capability is you're trying to acquire and deliver. How are we doing? How is the department doing? Just a quick search of acquisition program challenges, acquisition program failures, acquisition program cost overruns, and you can easily find much more than these 4 headlines. It was easy for me to refer to programs like the Expeditionary Combat Support System, ECSS, and you can see that IEEE Spectra magazine referred to it as a bonfire. The Littoral Combat Ship, the F-35 has a lot of negative press. The Space Force is not immune to this criticism with respect to satellite acquisitions. And maybe just as a summary of how we're doing, the GAO has kept Department of Defense weapon systems acquisition on their high risk list for the last 30 plus years. Since 1990, it has been it's been a high risk area when they do their evaluations. How do we educate our acquisition workforce today? So starting with program management, you can see in the smaller square that there are multiple career fields within the acquisition workforce, and one of those, and the leader of the acquisition team is the program manager. And what I've done is pulled out the certification standards for program managers. Now, there are 3 levels of certification: level 1, 2, and 3. These are the certification standards for the highest level, the level 3 certification. And you can see that there is functional training. I appreciate perhaps the irony of the education line then saying there is no formal education required for certification. And then experience. It's a combination of these that allows you to achieve the highest level, the level 3 certification. Level 3 certification. The education that we're talking about here is pretty typical. It's pretty, I guess what I mean by typical is it's maybe 20th century education. It's live classroom lectures with an instructor or subject matter expert in the front of the room, and students participating in quizzes and exercises, and some amount of hands-on and a limited amount of simulation that goes on. And then there's a great deal of distance learning or computer-based training that acquisition professionals go through. Unfortunately, that can often be characterized as click and drool. In fact, I knew of one officer who paid his daughter to click next on the CBT until she got to the quiz, and then her father would come in and take the quiz, and then when they jumped into the next module, she'd come back in and keep clicking next on the material. Clearly, there was no learning going on here, but it was a box checking activity, and unfortunately, there's still some of that going on. At the highest level, managing the highest dollar value and highest visibility acquisition programs, we call those acquisition category 1. Program managers who are in charge of ACAT 1 programs also participate in what's called the Defense Systems Management College. And the first class that they take is an 8-week class where the students go through dozens of case studies. So this is an improvement in the critical thinking and decision-making education as it puts the student or participant into the protagonist's position in the case study and ultimately asks, okay, given the scenario and the situation, what would you do? But the thing about a case study is that you get to make that decision one time. You review all of the background material and then are placed in a scenario, and essentially at the end the question is, all right, the case studies often end with Lieutenant Colonel Smith has to brief the decision authority tomorrow. What is he going to say? And then the student or participant in the case study then puts themselves in Lieutenant Colonel Smith's position and has a small group discussion about what they would do, followed by a large group. The methodology that's followed in the Defense Systems Management College is the Harvard case study method, and so you review the case study, come up with your own assessment, you have a small group discussion, then you have a large group discussion. When the student or participant maybe learns after they come up with their assessment, they may have a modified assessment, or they may learn something different in either the small or the large group discussions. But in terms of what happens next, what they really get is the rest of the story, right? At the end of I know when I participated in the program, we always want to know, okay, so what really happened? What did Lieutenant Colonel Smith decide to do, and how did it work? And so then we could think to ourselves, well, if Lieutenant Colonel Smith had done what I suggested, then of course it would have been a smashing success. But you only get to make that one decision. The reason I believe wargaming has a role to play, particularly as you'll see later, my recommendation for education purposes, is that you get to make that decision multiple times. This graphic I pulled from Ed McGrady's question and answer session at last year's Connections conference. The idea that in a war game, I'm faced with a decision of what to do. I have that feeling of anticipation that you can have when you're making a decision about multiple courses of action. And then there's some manner of resolution that I don't believe you get in a case study. And more pointedly, then you have to live with the consequences of that decision. So if you made maybe not the best decision, let's not say it was a mistake necessarily, but you made a suboptimal decision, well, then that's going to have consequences and set up the next decision you're going to have to make. And maybe you can recover and get back to the program baseline, or maybe you can't. And so at the end, I'm getting ahead a little bit about education. At the end, you have a hot wash and go over, well, what were you thinking when you made this decision? And what might have happened if you had gone another way? And the great thing about a war game is you could play it again and go that other way and then find out what happened. There's two fundamental components of a war game that I want to highlight that I believe make wargaming a good fit for the acquisition community. And I take this from Phil Sabin's Simulating War book, that those two fundamental components are the underlying mathematical model of reality and then an iterative set of active decisions. So first of all, the idea that we can somehow model the situation. And granted, reality is complex, and we're going to build a model that we hope has as high enough level of fidelity as we can achieve, so that we can learn from the experience of the war game, that we can trust that the decisions we make and the consequences that we see in the war game are realistic and could happen in the real world. The idea that we have an environment for experimenting is huge, particularly because one of the main criticisms of the Department of Defense acquisition culture today is that the culture is very risk averse, that it is almost better for me to follow the established procedure and fail than to try and do something innovative or different. Because think about it, if I follow what we've done in the past, and maybe perhaps the unwritten checklist of how you go about acquiring a certain system, and it doesn't work, then I'm almost absolved of response. Well, I did what we've been trained to do. I followed the checklist and it didn't work. But if I venture out and I try to do something innovative, and I try to come up with a new way of doing things that is not the current standard, I put myself out there, right? If it doesn't work, then it was, why didn't you follow the checklist? Why'd you do it that way? And you open yourself up to criticism. If I have a decent enough fidelity model of my acquisition universe, I can get into that war game and I can try things. I can build up the muscle memory of attempting something innovative and trying something different. And if I experience in the war game that trying this thing different really didn't cause a catastrophic failure, well, I might build up the nerve and the muscle memory again to try that in real life. And so this experimental environment, I think, is one of the key aspects that is needed, and we certainly want to be able to model the complex reality of acquisitions. The second step, and I kind of highlighted this in the distinction between case studies and war games, is that it's an iterative set of active decision inputs. So based on the decision I make early in the war game, that's setting the game situation and the game setting for the next decision, and so on. And so I can continue to make poor decisions and end up with a terrible outcome. I can make an initial poor decision, but maybe perhaps recover. But in any event, I'm going to experience the feelings of the challenge of making that decision, the anticipation of, okay, how did it go? Did it work? Was it a good decision? And then live with the consequences, at least inside the game, inside the situation. From another acquisition perspective, right? Another commercial game that might provide a model of how we could do things inside acquisitions. Perhaps I get my get out of jail free card because my contract specialist card gets me from the protest, and then we move on. Okay, my contract award wasn't protested. Now we move on. Well, I'm going to face other challenges, and one of my other teammates might have a deficiency in an area that causes us a problem. So there's to me, my first inclination, probably even before I read Dunnigan's book, but after reading James Dunnigan's book on wargaming, my first inclination is plagiarize, go with what exists. And to me, the idea of taking a commercial game and replacing the situation that the commercial game is facing and just morphing it into an acquisition situation seems like the first step. And then if we can build a community of wargamers, then maybe we can start coming up with from the ground up developed specifically war games. But I think there's a lot of application for modified commercial games. Chad's not the only one that's thinking about this. The acquisition research program, the 17th annual symposium held last year, had 2 papers that investigated either wargaming directly or simulation-based education or simulation-based applications that read very much like a war game or very similar to a war game. And then the Defense Acquisition Magazine, a couple of years ago, that cover story, simulation and scenario-based training, that story was hinting at war game-like applications to the acquisition workforce. And so you can see 2019 for that Defense Acquisition Magazine article, and 2020 with the Acquisition Research Program proceedings in the 2 papers. And yet there's really still not a big foothold with respect to with wargaming inside acquisitions. One of the papers in that that I referred to in the Acquisition Research Program Symposium documented a RAND designed and prototyped seminar style game on what we call the middle tier of acquisition. And as I mentioned on the slide with the pathways, it's kind of an in-between acquisition path between the kind of longer, more standard major capability acquisition and the ultra quick urgent operational need capability acquisition. And so in this war game, the participants were developing an acquisition strategy, and the idea was for them to identify which pathway they would select, and you can see on the game board that there was an option to do not acquire at all. And so what the participants were provided was the requirement, the capability requirement, the state of the industry in that with respect to the technologies required to meet that requirement, and other background information. And then they were asked to determine which pathway they would select. The majority of them, all of them that decided to acquire a material solution at all, picked the middle tier, and then they were asked to then describe with their game pieces the cost, schedule, and performance risks associated with following the middle tier. So this was an acquisition war game, but this was a research activity. Again, that I'm not aware has proliferated across the acquisition community. Back in 2017, at Hanscom Air Force Base, they performed an acquisition war game. I would suggest a relatively low fidelity acquisition war game. And what they were doing is they were determining the appropriate acquisition strategies to counter specific cyber threats. And so they were presented with a scenario of cyberspace threats and cyberspace risks, and asked to come up with the appropriate acquisition strategy to deter it. So there's been some investigation into this concept. There just hasn't been wide-scale adoption. The 3 specific applications I would like to suggest the acquisition community could benefit from, including wargaming as a tool, as a methodology, are to evaluate acquisition strategies, kind of a little like what we just talked about. Both the RAND and the Hanscom exercise were picking an acquisition strategy. You'll see on evaluating the acquisition strategies, I'm more suggesting that you've already selected an acquisition strategy and let's wargame it. I think wargames would be a great tool for what I liken to an acquisition program office check ride. Oftentimes in the acquisition community, we particularly I'll say in the Air Force acquisition community, we will use aircraft or pilot analogies, and why not? We are the Air Force. So the idea of a check ride, I think, has a lot of benefit inside a program office, and I think war games provide a methodology to do that. And then finally, for education purposes, the first application to evaluate acquisition strategies, I have been fascinated by a comment that Matt Caffrey made one time, that it is Air Force doctrine to wargame operation plans. And what I mean by that is, if you've developed an operation plan and it is how you're going to prosecute a major operation, it is Air Force doctrine to apply that to wargame it, to evaluate it, to determine, to get insight into how well that plan will work or not. And why? Because we may learn through the war game that we've missed something, that something needs to be modified, or that this one aspect of the plan is super high risk and we need to apply some mitigation or contingency to bolster ourselves against that risk. Well, what is an acquisition strategy if it's not an operation plan to acquire and develop a weapons system or service capability? So if we have as our way of doing business that we war game operation plans, I think there's a very direct analogy to wargaming acquisition strategies. And the idea would be to build this competency such that the decision authorities, when presented with the acquisition strategy, such that they're the ones that sign off that, yes, this is the acquisition strategy we will pursue in order to acquire this capability, that these decision authorities would imagine a future where these decision authorities ask, okay, and what did you learn when you wargamed the acquisition strategy? If every program manager knew they were going to have to answer that question, then they would know that they needed to wargame, because the answer of, well, we didn't wargame it, probably wouldn't fly. And it could be that we don't wargame every single acquisition strategy for every single program that's being acquired, but remember, I referred to the acquisition category 1 programs. Those are the highest dollar, highest visibility programs. Those are the ones that maybe bear the additional scrutiny of having applied it to a war game. Why wargaming an acquisition strategy, and how does it apply? Well, recall the two key components that I wanted to highlight out of Sabin's book of two key components of a wargame. We certainly have a complex model of reality in terms of how we intend to move forward with acquiring a capability. And if you look at it, there are all kinds of iterative decisions to be made along the way. So this acquisitions world lends itself, I believe, to the ability to use a war game to evaluate and determine what we can learn, what we can glean from the war game about our acquisition strategy. What might it look like? Okay, and this is out of one of the acquisition research panel papers, right? So there's a scenario. There's the program team. Outcome. I don't like. Just you can see what I'm putting the circle with a line through. I don't like the idea of considering industry a red cell. We are more and more encouraged to think of industry as our partners in acquiring these weapon systems, and I believe that is, in my experience, that is absolutely true. I have been on a major acquisition program where we had an adversarial relationship with our contractor, and that was an inefficient way of getting to the capability for our warfighters and for our taxpayers who are providing the resources for that capability. So I'm not sure I like the idea of the red cell being industry. And in this case, there might not be an active enemy that is making decisions to counter your decisions. But in all other aspects, I believe this graphic holds as a possibility. We have experts here, and we're putting in a scenario and events, and so then there's an inject, and then the interface to the program team that is making the decision. They make a decision, and then the white cell adjudicates it. And then remember my emphasis. One of the things I think is the most beneficial aspect of wargaming inside the acquisition community, and particularly to evaluate this acquisition strategy, of those yellow arrows that. And then we do it again based on the decision you just made. to react to that event inject. Now we go through, it's adjudicated, and now the scenario has changed and been modified. And so we come back into it and we keep going through. The activity levels, the stress, and the decisions, if we have modeled the acquisition environment to a decent level of fidelity, then those are going to be the same or similar activity levels, stress, and decisions that the program team would face while executing the acquisition strategy anyway. Or perhaps we do it in a matrix game methodology. And admittedly, I am a neophyte in designing or maybe controlling a matrix game. But from my neophyte knowledge of a matrix game, you could have the program team, the integrated product team. They are looking at which pathway to pursue in order to acquire this system for a warfighter. So they decide that they want to go down to the defense business system pathway, and they brief that to their milestone decision authority. That's the person that's going to ultimately approve the acquisition strategy. So they offer inside the matrix game, they offer pros. The negatives are also presented, and then the umpire adjudicates that based on the pros, the cons, and the injection of chance, which is another benefit of using war games in the acquisition community. Is chance does often rear its head and make the best laid plans have other situations to deal with, right? And you could have a great plan, and then chance comes up, and for some reason it doesn't work. And then again, what I like about a war game is then you have to live with those consequences and make subsequent decisions. So once whatever pathway they've selected, let's say that the umpire adjudicates it, and it's determined that the milestone decision authority selects the defense business system pathway. That pathway is approved. The next step would be, all right, well, we are going to get a new system. We're going to select a new system development from scratch instead of perhaps purchasing a commercial off-the-shelf solution or modifying a commercial off-the-shelf solution. Then we follow the process. Team members offer the pros, why this would work. The why this won't work will also be presented, and then ultimately it'll be adjudicated with the addition of chance. And then the team will move on to the next step and continue and work their way through and evaluate their acquisition strategy to determine and get feedback and insight into whether this is a good decision or not. The second application, war games as an acquisition check ride. When pilots are first flying a new aircraft, they take a check ride. Now they may know they know how to fly, and for my aviation friends, I don't mean anything demeaning by stick goes forward, houses get bigger, stick goes back, houses get smaller, right? They know the fundamentals of how to fly a plane, but they haven't flown an F-16 yet. And so they take a check ride in an F-16 so that they can get checked out in flying that particular aircraft. If they've lost currency, if they've been in a staff job for a couple of years, when they come back, if they're not current in that platform, they'll take a check ride in order to be rechecked out into that aircraft. I'm suggesting an analogous capability for program teams. The reason I do that is this has been the injection of experiential education and training has been something I've written and spoken about before. On the left is a Defense Acquisition Magazine article, and on the right is a presentation that I've given that likens the idea of a teaching program office to a teaching hospital. That will soon be in a paper if I can ever dedicate myself to writing it. The concept that I'm referring to with respect to experiential education, in that first paper that I just showed, I use two other analogies with respect to getting football players ready for football and pilots ready for flying combat missions. And by the way, for our international partners, I mean American football. And so the fundamentals, right? We teach. We'll go down the football path first, right? The fundamentals, we teach everybody how to block and tackle. They're just skills and techniques that you need to know in order to play the game of football. But then your team has a specific way of playing the game. You have an offensive scheme and a defensive scheme. That's your system. And so you have offensive and defensive plays. And so you have to learn, I have to learn those plays. So how do I block and tackle on this team? And then I practice those plays. I go and I run those plays and I drill those plays over and over and over again. The next thing I'll do is I'll go do a scrimmage game, right? I'll play a game against an opponent who is actively trying to stop me, but it doesn't count. If I lose a scrimmage game, I'm hoping that the only consequence is learning. There's a great scene in the movie We Are Marshall where after the coaching staff, and if you're not familiar with the Marshall situation, their football team and their coaching staff were tragically lost in a plane crash. And when they restarted their football program, their new head coach wanted to bring his system and teach the players how to play. And they found in practice and when scrimmaging that they couldn't execute that system with those players. So they learned that this won't work with who we have, and they needed to come up with a new system. And they learned all of that before actually playing a game that counts. So the idea is you learn the fundamentals, you learn how to execute those fundamentals in your system, you practice them against an opponent who's actively trying to stop you, and then you play the games, then all of that before you actually try and play the game for real. The pilot, I won't go through the whole pilot analogy, but you can see that it follows a very similar methodology. Here's how I view the acquisition training, current Department of Defense acquisition training. We teach initial skills training to our acquisition program managers. I'll focus on our program managers. We do give them the fundamentals. We teach them how the acquisition system works and some of the fundamental tools, techniques, and best practices and skills that they need in order to do that. And then we kick them out to go manage a program in a program office. Those missing layers are, I suggest they are akin to teaching a pilot how to fly any airplane and then asking them to go execute missions in combat without actually in a different airplane, or teaching somebody how to block and tackle and then throwing them out there to play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, right? And so there's a missing layers of education and training, and that's where I think an acquisition check ride can help fill the gap, fill the void. Again, what might it look like? I would suggest that each program office would have a canned war game or two that fits what they do. So our program offices are typically organized around the capability that they are delivering. So there is a fighter program office and an F-15 and an F-16 and F-22 program office. And so you could have canned war games that deal with acquiring air superiority fighter aircraft or modifying existing ones. And twice a year you could run the war game. So nobody in the program office would be further than 6 months away from having the opportunity to get checked out in how the program office does business. How do they do what is their system? How do they execute the blocking and tackling of acquisitions? It could also be a way for remedial training. You haven't been through certain processes, you could go through a war game. And it could be a team building activity. And as long as they're updated frequently, they would remain relevant. To the team building activity, the idea of having an intact team go through one of these war games, I think, gives them the ability that once that real thing occurs, they have less of a learning curve. When I took over the infrared countermeasure expendables, so flares that defeat infrared guided missiles, when I took over that program office in August of 2001, we were given an exercise where we had to react to an urgent capability need. And for a week, we practiced how we would do that. Well, in September of 2001, 9/11 happened, and A month later, we got a real urgent capability need, and my team had learned from having tried it, had learned from having practiced it before, and had some muscle memory on what to do in order to achieve and deliver this capability. And it showed in our ability to rapidly acquire those capabilities. Finally, the third application is for education. It can reinforce, as Fielder says, it can reinforce learning through practice. Because what we're trying to do is build adaptive experience, right? This muscle memory. We're trying to make it such that when these situations happen for real, that again, based on the level of fidelity of our model of our abstract model of reality, we've experienced this before, and we can react in ways that we have confidence have a high probability or likelihood of working. Two different types of games on an educational side: a teaching game where we are specifically trying to get the students to learn a lesson. So we could craft a war game such that where we want them to know that the middle tier of acquisition, which is new, which is something that many acquisition professionals have no experience using, might be the right way, and we want them to understand the situations where it works. So if we craft the game in a certain way, if they don't select mid-tier of acquisition, it could have negative consequences. The capability is delivered late to need, those kind of consequences. And then in the hot wash after the game, why didn't you select a middle tier? And they can learn that specific lesson that we're trying to get them. Then there's the learning game, where we just let the game run its course, and we expect that the students are going to learn. They're going to learn about acquisitions and the practice of their craft, but we don't have a specific objective in mind for them to learn. We just want them to have the experiential learning of going through their process. And my example, again, using a commercial game, was perhaps a D&D like role-playing game, where we have a game integrated product team in a scenario, and they roll up their characters. So we wouldn't have barbarians and druids. We'd have program managers, contracting, and finance. We would use intelligence, wisdom, conscious, and they would have these scores. And I don't know, maybe strength and dexterity does have an application, or maybe we come up with acquisition specific abilities, but they would roll them up. So there'd be chance involved. You might be a program manager that rolls low on Constitution, and that would impact some of the decisions that are made later. And they would earn experience points. So there's an analogy here, I believe, to using Dungeons and Dragons-like game to work through and either have a specific learning objective we want the students to take away, or just have them learn about their craft by going through the situation. Similarly, a pandemic-type cooperative game, where you have your random assignment of roles based on which cards you get. The game situation will be different every time you play because the initial conditions are set, and could be playing a different role, and so on. So I believe war games are very attractive as a methodology for those three specific applications, because we have significant historical information on acquisitions. And to the extent that what we did before has an impact or leads to consequences of what we're going to do in the future, having that body of historical information can help us develop games. The games provide dynamic situations to be iterative, dynamic situations where we have to make decisions, and then we have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And then finally, the opportunity to practice taking risks and find out that it's really not the end of the world if you try something innovative and you try something new. Back to one of the key criticisms of the acquisition culture today, that it is very risk averse. If we can practice and build up this muscle memory of trying new things and learning that, hey, it's not all bad when you try something new. From one of the previous papers I referenced, this is a potential infrastructure. Okay, there's a couple. There's ways that we can do this. We know. Many of you, particularly in this conference, know how to establish war games. We in the Department of Defense know how to do war games. It's just very rarely applied to the acquisition community. So it would just be a matter of turning our focus to a different community and applying the tools and techniques that that work best in that community, and coming up with new ones that maybe are unique to the community. What are we doing about it in the future? The Air Force is working with Matt Caffrey on a Wargame 101 course. What we're essentially doing is taking Matt's class that he already teaches to Air Force personnel, and we are coming up with a distance learning version of it that can reach a broader audience and greater numbers. In terms of applications of war games, both the Air Force and the Space Force are investigating a class much sooner. Remember, I said that the Acquisition Category 1 program managers get case study education. Well, they're very long in their careers by the time they get to that point. What we'd like to do is move to the left. Let's inject some of this experiential simulation-based education. Let's move it to the left earlier in our program managers' careers. And one of the ways that we're looking to do that is to inject war games as an educational tool. And then one of the things that I am investigating more specifically as the Chief Learning Officer inside Space Systems Command is making on-the-job training less ad hoc. We know what goes on. What we'd like to do is make sure it's going on, and make sure it's going on in some consistent manner, and then provide some tools to ensure a minimum level of capability. And back to my idea of war games as a check ride. I think war games are a potentially valuable tool in the on-the-job training aspect of getting our program managers ready. That's the material, and I see that there's a bunch of questions, and that's my contact information, my email. I am a huge fan of that Picasso quote. As somebody who's been involved in acquisition education now for about eight years after having been in the acquisition workforce executing, the idea of learning the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist, that it's the first part that I think we do pretty well. We teach the rules, but what we need to do is we need to get the education and the experiential learning to our workforce to help them know when deviating from those rules, i.e. breaking them, makes the most sense, when deviating from the checklist is the right thing to do. And so that's the content. I'll go ahead and open it up now for questions that I think Graham said there's quite a few.
There are quite a few, and they're really good, which is why I've popped up, because I'm really keen to get to them. Chad, that was fantastic. I can absolutely see why Matt asked you to give that presentation. You are clearly preaching to the converted, but even so, that was just spot on. So without further ado, David, can we just run through the questions from top to bottom, please?
So, John, absolutely, very much so today, and I'm going to be clear today. Much of the DAU education, and I'm not trying to bash my brothers and sisters at the Defense Acquisition University, but the way we do our certification process lends to, I just need to get this thing done. I don't necessarily care if I learn, but I've got to get this thing done. So it lends itself to box checking. There is a new process that is starting 1 October that they've removed much of the core certification education requirements, and they've necked that down to just what you need to know, and everything else is still available, but it's get it just in time right before you're going to take that assignment and that kind of thing. So unfortunately, there's a lot of that box checking.
Okay, cool. Next one, please.
So therein lies the right. It's easy for Chad to say, "Hey, we should use war games for acquisition purposes and applications." When you get into the nitty gritty, who adjudicates the outcomes and how? One of the things that is a consistent theme in the multiple acquisition reform initiatives that have been ongoing for say the last 50 to 60 years in the Department of Defense, and there have been a number of them, is that many of the reports and recommendations have common themes, and so oftentimes we know what we need to do, we just don't have the will to do it. Similarly, the failures and the consequences of the decisions that we've made are common, right? If we award a poor contract and then it's delivered late or over budget, that's not, that's not hard to make that connection. And so the likely outcomes would, the decision table, as you were, would be built based on that historical information that in the past, when you've made this type of poor decision, this has been the outcome. And then again, I like the injection of chance, and maybe it's a die roll. And if you roll a 6, even though it was a bad decision, you got lucky and it actually worked. And then you keep moving through the game. How important is that the outcomes are realistic? I think if we're going, let's look at the applications. If we're going to use the war game to evaluate an acquisition strategy, I think it's very important that the outcome is realistic, because again, I envision that world where a decision maker says, what did you learn from the war game? Well, if my outcomes were not realistic, then what I learned might not really be applicable. I'll say that on the education side, we really want them to be realistic, but in a specific teaching game, if we want them to learn a specific outcome or a specific learning objective, it might be we game the game such that the outcomes are not necessarily realistic, because we want them to experience that anticipation of making the decision and the negative consequence of how it worked out, so that they realize the next time they have to make a similar decision, I remember that time I did that and it was a game, but I did that and I didn't like the feeling of finding out it didn't work. Let me go the other way.
Spot on. Brilliant. Next one.
Oh, good question. So again, a common criticism of the workforce is a high level of risk aversion. Should the facilitators encourage them? Yes, and in fact, the game, I believe the game could be crafted that way. I would suggest that we would, in what I would love as part of an innovation curriculum to our acquisition workforce, that one of the pieces of that curriculum would involve an education war game, and it would be the learning game, and not the teaching. There's not necessarily a specific learning objective we want them to get out of this particular game, but we want them to feel what it's like to be. We want to put them in a situation where they the only way to really succeed would be to be creative and innovative, right? And you can have the game master, the control, you could have them keep gearing them back. I mean, where if they pick something that is tried and true and boring and staid and not innovative, right? The game master could easily just insert themselves as the decision maker that says it was summarily disapproved. You were sent back to the drawing board with a recommendation that you need to be more innovative and creative, right? And so I think that should be there should be an innovation risk seeking type of curriculum that our workforce is at least exposed to, if not required to take. And a war game, I think, would be a perfect part of that curriculum.
Absolutely. Next question.
Outside pressure. I think if we did and I am generally a naive optimist when it comes particularly to my own ideas. And so I'm not sure, and I might not be answering this right, Robert, so you can follow up necessarily, but I'll think of a couple of different outside pressures. One, I want outside pressures in the game. Because that's one of the things that makes Department of Defense acquisitions very difficult, is the broad number of stakeholders that are engaged. You may think you're just working with a warfighting customer to deliver the capability, but where does your funding come from? It comes from the the ones that sign the checks. That's the United States Senate, right? And so they've got contractors in across the country with facilities and that kind of thing whose interests they're been elected to represent. And so there's a broad base of outside pressures that I want inside the game. if what you're asking is more outside pressures that influence the game so that it goes a certain way, I would, and I'm trying to recall a really good presentation by one of my facilitators. And Chris, I'm going to get your name wrong. I don't Weuve. Chris, I sat through a presentation where he talked about this, about senior leaders and people who might have an agenda in that they would want to manipulate. Oh, that was a hard word. I shouldn't have gone with manipulate. That they want to influence the outcome of the game a certain way. And that to me, that gets to, let's roll my constitution score, and see, because I just think the game designer does the best they can. The control in the game does the best they can to keep those outside influences out. But ultimately, humans are designing the games and humans are playing the games. And so they are not immune to human frailties, I guess. And I can fully see where that might be a less than satisfactory answer.
Okay, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes and still a couple of questions, which I'd love to know the answers to. So next one, please.
Absolutely. I think if I'm going to satisfactorily wargame an acquisition strategy, I have to do just that. If I can have the actual decision makers play the game, I think there's a real benefit, perhaps, to getting one of these stakeholders and have them play as the program manager. Okay, have them feel what it's like inside the war game to make that decision, and understand the consequences of somebody else is playing their role in the game, and they play their role appropriately and inject something, and the PM's got to react to it. I think if that stakeholder had to feel what it was like to live with that inject, who knows, maybe they'd be less likely down the road to do that, more sympathetic to the program manager later on. So I think it's a great idea.
Cool. I think there's 2 more.
So introducing wargaming, I think introducing it to the acquisition community wouldn't be that much of a stretch. My big way of doing it would be to surprise them and to just have it be part of their educational curriculum, right? And now introducing it as a tool for evaluating acquisition strategies, that might be a hard sell, but those decision authorities are generally senior officers or senior civilians who, in many cases, have been outside the acquisition community and are familiar with the idea that the acquisition community does play in war games, but they play in operational war games, and they play a very small role of bringing acquisitions into it. But what we don't do is war game acquisitions. How do they respond to the introduction of chance? I think it would just, they'll respond the same way I would when someone rolls the dice and I don't like the result. Well, that's crap. That wouldn't really happen. That's just because you rolled a 1 out of a 6. And then I think it's up to control or people inside the game to explain, look, we built the decision tables based on historical reality. And there is a, historically, I don't know the decision table would be this precise to say that there was a 16% chance that historically that this would happen. But we would say, we would bring up things like, have you ever been on an acquisition effort where your contractor went on strike? You didn't plan for them to go on strike, but they did, and you had to deal with it. That's chance.
Yeah. Cool. Final question, 1 minute.
Wow, what factors? The big things that I would want them to consider are the application, the ability to recognize when it makes sense to deviate from the established procedure and do something different because it makes sense, and building up that muscle memory so that they feel like they can do that in the real world. That's my primary objective in all 3 applications, is to allow wargaming to provide that experiential education piece that makes acquisition strategies better, makes them better at doing their job every day, and helps them learn how to be better acquisition professionals.
Cool. What a good answer to a set of very good questions. Chad, it is really, really easy for me to say thank you when you've just smashed it out of the park. That was just cracking. I mean, you are talking to the preaching to the converted to an extent, but you just obviously taken some best practice and you're applying it. Your enthusiasm comes through, and it is just fantastic. So that was quite special. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you again. Your son got married a few days ago. Thank you for making the time to talk to us. That was just spot on. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. I appreciate it. Everybody, please reach out to me if you have a way to make this happen.
Fantastic. All right. Cheers. Take care. All the best.
Thank you.